This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 2 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 8th, 1910. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford then. The January 8th issue begins with the Westford Center section. At the monthly meeting of Edward M. Abbott Hose Company No. 1, the supper was in charge of John Feeney, Fred Clement, and J. Henry Colburn. This hose company had monthly meetings that were dinners, and they took turns being responsible for cooking up the dinners. Some of them sounded pretty good when they talked about what they were. Committee appointed for the supper at the next meeting is Alec Fisher, Peter Clement, and W.E. Carkin. I believe that's Warren Carkin. The topic uppermost in the minds of those having nimble feet was the second annual ball of the company, which is scheduled for the near future. Frank C. Wright and Samuel H. Balch, the two RFD carriers, had a well-earned holiday New Year's Day. Sunday coming the next day made a 2 days rest, which, after the Christmas work and the hard traveling from the snowstorm, must have been particularly welcome. Schools reopened Monday after the winter vacation. Miss Norris, teacher of ability and experience, takes the place of Miss Babbitt, resigned. Miss Edith Lawrence did not return this week owing to an attack of tonsillitis. This is a reference to the William E. Frost School in Westford Center. Fred A. Smith went last week to Lake Weir, Florida, expecting to be gone until the 1st of April. This is the same town where Mr. and Mrs. Austin H. Foss and Mr. and Mrs. Pearl Harmon are located for the winter. Mrs. James Spinner is ill at her home with pneumonia, and at this writing is quite fairly comfortable. Reverend Mr. Charles Marshall gave his hearers a talk suitable to the new year, Sunday morning, at the vestry of the Congregational Church on, quote, making good, end quote, and whatever we undertook. He sent out on the first of the year cards of greetings and good wishes to parishioners. During the remainder of their stay in our midst, Mrs. Marshall will preside at the organ for the morning service. Elizabeth Wells, who was born December 19th, 1909 in Westford, is the name of the little lady who has come to dwell in the home of Dr. and Mrs. Wells. The Runaway is the name of the next paragraph. Late last Thursday afternoon, when Samuel H. Balch, carrier of RFD Route Number 2, returned to the post office at the center, he left his horses standing for a moment unhitched while he went inside. The animals were tired and fretted with the severe cold and started for home on their own account, breaking into a gallop down the main street. They ran straight by their home driveway, and it was well that they did, for they would probably have had an upset at the pace they were going. They ran for about a mile, and when opposite George Whitney's, Will E. Wright, who was coming from Lowell with his team, met them. He at once took in the situation and, with characteristic dexterity and precision, stopped the frightened animals, which is something of a feat where there are two. Nothing was broken, and the outfit was safely returned to its owner. Next is a paragraph on the Tadmuck Club. Owing to the severity of the weather Tuesday afternoon, it was but a small group of the members of the Tadmuck Club who met in Library Hall for the first meeting of the year. Miss Loker was unable to be present, and Miss Ella F. Ildreth, the vice president, presided. The subject for the afternoon was the first of the series on Alaska, this one being, quote, Alaska, topographical features, end quote. Miss Emily F. Fletcher, chairman. Miss Lawrence, who was to have given a paper, was unable to be present. Miss Cushing and Miss Grant gave their respective parts, describing the route one would take to visit this country. At the close of the program, those present enjoyed informally an inspection of the first group of pictures, now in exhibition, of scenes in the famous Yosemite Valley. The next section is called Resignation. On Sunday at the Congregational Church, Reverend Mr. Marshall gave his hearers a good sermon based on lessons of the Christmas tide. After the preaching service, he conducted the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, and at the close of this, members were asked to remain for some items of business, and when these were concluded, Leonard Wheeler, clerk of the church, was asked to take the chair, Mr. Marshall retiring from the assembly. The following letter, which speaks for itself, was then read to the clerk. To the Union Congregational Church, Westford. Dear friends, it is nearly 5 years since you called me to be your pastor. For all the kindness you have shown to us, I want to thank you. These over 4 years have been happy ones. They will live in our memories as we cannot hope any others ever will. Westford must ever be remembered as our first home. But I feel that the time has come for me to ask you to release me from the pastorate on January 31st. For me to go means not only the breaking of my relationship with the church, but also my citizenship in a town which I have enjoyed into the life of which I have entered with great pleasure, and above all it means a separation from friends we have both learned to know and to love. It is only the duty that I feel that I owe to the kingdom that makes me ask that this pastoral tie be broken, and that I may be allowed to take up another work. Most sincerely yours, Charles P. Marshall. It was voted to accept this resignation with much regret. Mr. Marshall has made many warm friends among his church people and in the community, entering into their joys and sorrows with a genuineness and sincerity which will always be cherished. He also had the energy and ability to identify himself with the larger welfare of the village life. He has been an active member of the Grange, serving efficiently as its lecturer, chaplain, and on its committee for entertainment courses for several seasons. He has also been most helpful in the Tadmuck Club since its organization. Mr. Marshall resigns to accept the pastorate of the Washington Street Congregational Church, Quincy, Mass., which is a much larger field than this. Both he and Mrs. Marshall and their little daughter of the parsonage, who has been the pet of the whole parish, will take with them the heartiest goodwill and good wishes of the Westford people. Next comes the About Town section. Miss Sarah Richardson, who has been seriously ill with indigestion at her home at Brookside, is regaining her youthful appetite and other symptoms of recovery. 91 years does much for constitutional ability and the skill of Dr. Wells to encourage. Wednesday was Inauguration Day at Boston. Among those present as part of the new state government and as a wise advisory counselor to the governor was our own well-equipped Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher. He was elected to the Governor's Council. If he proves as wise in counsel for the state as in counsel to himself in business and social life, those who would disapprove ought to go away back and sit down in the lonesome corner. J. Elbro Fletcher, he spells that his first name, or actually it's his middle name, Elbro, A-L-B-R-O. Fletcher, having tired of zero and the frosty jingle of sleigh bells, has hied himself to the sunny and more equatorial clime of the South. When 3 persons froze to death in sunny Alabama during the last snow blizzard, it is a query whether the change will warm the situation or not. Preparations are being made at Councilor Fletcher's stone quarry to install in the spring one of the large-sized stone crushers capable of taking in the ordinary derrick scoopful. The one to be discarded, which has been long in use, is a pepper box in comparison to the new one. Alvin Poley, who has been shortened up in usefulness with rheumatism and other adversities of old age, has temporarily at least got a walking start of them and is out and around the farmyard barn. The WCTU, that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, met with Mr. Samuel L. Taylor Wednesday afternoon. The president, Mrs. Frank C. Hildreth, presiding, read a letter from Catherine Lenty Stevenson. Her middle name is Lente, Lente, Stevenson, no N, who at present is traveling in Australia, giving an account of temperance work in that country. The minutes of the last meeting were read by Mrs. Emma Day. The company sang the state song with Mrs. Janet Wright as accompanist. Voted to have a food sale January 21st at the home of Mrs. Emery J. Whitney. The annual fox hunt is to be held at Bedford, January 10th through the 15th. Harry N. Fletcher of Graniteville is one of the directors, and Henry A. Fletcher of Oak Hill is a member of the club. The at-home sentiment met life-size illustration January 1st when the family of Nelson moved from West Chelmsford into their cozy bungalow cottage at Brookside. New bright lights and new bright faces add much to the life at the eastern boundary of Stony Brook Valley and close to the shadows of Brookside Mills. Middlesex North Pomona Grange will light up with a Farmers Institute at Westford Town Hall Wednesday, January 12th. The address in the morning will be given by George Albert Drew, whom all Westford once knew. His subject will be orcharding. The afternoon will be given to variety with a humorous reader as a basis. Next paragraph is entitled Entertainment. The Christmas concert at the Unitarian Church, postponed on account of the storm, was held in the vestry Sunday evening. Christmas and New Year's songs were sung by the Sunday School. Recitation by Master John Fletcher, Bertram Sutherland, Miss Marjorie Seavey, Miss Lillian Sutherland, and Miss Pauline Dale. Miss Evelyn Hamlin delighted with the solo on the violin. The Sunday School was liberally remembered with gifts to read, gifts to eat, and some tender to look at. The sick and those limp with age or shut in from the sunny helpfulness of weekly meetings were tenderly remembered. These outward tokens of goodwill received a stimulant in a few wise words from Reverend Benjamin Bailey, who emphasized the vital utility in Christmas and New Year's. Next comes the Forge Village section. Christmas services were held in St. Andrew's Mission Sunday evening, January 2nd, and were attended by a large number. Many were present from St. Andrew's Church, Ayer. The mission house was beautiful in its decorations of laurel, Christmas bells, and many flowers, and the singing of the Festival Te Deum by the vested choir was of the usual high order. Reverend Thomas L. Fisher conducted the services and held the close attention of the congregation during the sermon. He was the pastor of the church, St. Andrew's Church in Ayer, the mother church of St. Andrew's Mission in Forge Village. The teachers of Cameron School are planning to give the pupils a sleigh ride in the near future. Victor Pigeon, the butcher, who was burned out in Graniteville a short time ago, has purchased a piece of land from George O. Jackson on Pleasant Street and intends to build an up-to-date meat market. The land adjoins that of Cameron School. That long-looked-for snowstorm has arrived all right, and when it started in as a slight flurry of snow early Saturday evening, finally turned out to be a typical New England blizzard, and continued to snow and blow all Sunday. The steam cars were somewhat delayed in the morning, but made better time during the afternoon. The electric road did very good work, considering the weather, for the snowplow was kept busy during the day. The storm coming so suddenly made it very inconvenient for people visiting here from out of town, as well as those spending the holidays in the city. The members of the John Edwards Hose Company of the Westford Fire Department held the first meeting of the year at the club rooms Wednesday evening and elected the following officers for the ensuing year: Richard D. Prescott, Captain; Edmund Hunt, First Lieutenant; Edward T. Hanley, Second Lieutenant; George H. Weaver, Secretary; Walter Prescher, Treasurer; and William Hunt, Steward. After the business meeting was over, the following committee was chosen to make arrangements to hold their annual dance: Edward T. Hanley, General Manager; James Wiggum, J.W. Catchpole; Walter Precious, Assistants. The next section is called fierce combat. A well-known resident here was started out of his slumbers at 12:45 Sunday night when he heard a terrible moaning as if someone was in mortal agony on the piazza of his home, and the shuffling of many feet as if more than one person was trying to gain admittance. Bang, bang went the door several times in succession. Jumping out of bed, he hastily donned his clothes, while his better half threw open the window and called out who was there. Receiving no answer but groans, which grew fainter, he thought someone must be dying and decided to go out and investigate. Upon reaching the door, however, imagine his disgust when instead of the prostrate form of a man, he found a fierce cat fight in full progress. Grabbing a dipper of cold water to throw at them, he returned to the door to find the disturbers of the peace had already departed. He is now vowing vengeance on all cats that come within easy reaching distance. That the fight was a fierce one was seen the next morning when the doormat was found to be thickly covered with pussy's fur. The next couple paragraphs is called Settled in California. The many friends of Mr. and Mrs. Wilbert E. Parsons will be glad to hear news of them. They have left Rainier, Oregon, where they went the last of November, and are now at Riverside, California, where they intend to spend the winter. The distance from Rainier, Oregon to Riverside, California is 1,000 miles. Mr. and Mrs. Parsons reached their Sunday afternoon, December 18th, and are now staying with relatives, but intend to commence housekeeping until their return here. Mrs. Parsons writes that she can sit at her window and reach out and pick all the oranges she can eat. The roses are all in bud, but were nipped by the severe frost, which the residents there say was the worst in many years. The roads, she states, are of crushed stone and oiled, which makes traveling a pleasure. She sends greetings to her many friends. Next comes the Graniteville section. Ferdinand Pervin, spelled P-E-R-V-I-N, an older brother of Mrs. Hyacinth Leduc of this village, who has been in poor health for several months, fell downstairs on last week, Thursday, breaking his right arm in 2 places and injuring his collarbone, besides receiving a severe shaking up. Mr. Previn has made his home with the Leduc family for several years, and considering his age, that is 72 years, his recent mishap, coupled with his previous illness, leaves him in a serious condition at present. On last Saturday, being a holy day of obligation, Mass was celebrated in St. Catherine's Church at 7:30 a.m., Reverend J.J. McNamara being the celebrant. At the regular 9:45 Mass celebrated in St. Catherine's Church on Sunday morning, the pastor, Reverend Edmund T. Schofield, delivered an eloquent sermon appropriate for the new year, which made a deep impression on the large congregation present. Many watch meetings were held here on last week, Friday night, and those who watched the old year depart and the new year come in passed the time pleasantly with many vocal selections that were not entirely of a religious character. The custom is somewhat new to the people here, and if everything is all right at the next new year, it is thought that the chorus will be augmented by several new voices. All the schools opened here at the usual time on Monday morning, and the children returned much refreshed after their brief vacation. The last paragraph is titled, A Few Present. Many people from the village went up to Forge Village Pond on last Sunday in the hopes of witnessing a trial of speed between several of the fast horses in this vicinity. A few of the speeders were present with their drivers, but the surface of the pond was in such a slushy condition that it was thought advisable to call it off for the time being. Foreman William Leahy, who has charge of the ice houses at the pond, said although the ice was in poor condition for speeding horses, it was in excellent condition for cutting, for they had 12 inches of good solid ice there, and all that was needed was just one night of freezing after the thaw of Sunday, and everything would be in readiness for harvesting the annual crop. It is thought that the work of cutting will commence this week. either at Spectacle or Forge Village Ponds, both of which are very near together. Spectacle Pond is in Littleton on the Ayer border, just to the west of Forge Pond. That's the news in Westford for the week ending January 8th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing the technical assistance. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.